Hey, good morning, everybody. My name is Jon Hansen, and for those unfamiliar with me, I'll get into my background in just a moment. One of the things we want to talk about today's seminar is Zycus, Uberizing the purchasing process, and with the next-gen procure-to-pay solutions. Now, before I get into a little bit of who I am and what we're going to be covering today, I want to share with you some of the things regarding Zycus as an organization. Now, Zycus Comprehensive Solution Suite, the I-Council, is illustrated here. Now, one of the things that's interesting is I've been covering Zycus since 2008, 2009 in my blog, The Procurement Insights. And what's interesting about the organization, I actually interviewed one of their senior executives on my radio show and identified the company as being a future titan of the industry. And the reason I did that was quite simple, is that their innovative approach and their approach to changing the way in which we practice or purchase goods and services was quite leading edge at that particular point in time, as it was with a number of other organizations. And we've seen the manifestation of that, not only in the technological platform, but in the what you can call the awareness and the market penetration they have had with other companies. You know, back in those days, solutions such as this, and we'll get onto it, were looked upon as being a bolt-on solution to the back-end ERP world. But in reality, with the emergence of procure-to-pay solutions, with the emergence of the industry in the post-Gartner ERP era, companies like Zycus have come to the forefront, and we now recognize the power that they bring. And again, if you familiarize yourself with this particular council, the I-Council, you'll understand from where I'm coming. Now, the key when you look at the organization as a whole, and I just want to dig into a little bit of what you can say my perspective in terms of this. When you talk about Zycus as an organization, you'll see that progression. So even though they have been around for a while, they're not a new organization. In 2013, they made their mark. In 2015, they continued to lead the evolution of the procure-to-pay world. And a third time in a row, 2015, they were recognized in Gartner's Magic Quadrant for Strategic Sourcing Application Suites. And again, the industry is catching up. And, you know, there's a parallel here with regards to the Uberization of the procure-to-pay process, because their progression as an organization, and they've always had a strong technological platform, have most organizations of the innovators. I'll call the cloud-based solution providers or the SaaS providers who we know now. Most of these organizations have always been strong and had a strong platform from which they operated. It was only when Gartner and organizations in the industry began to recognize the shift, began to recognize the strength of these organizations as to what they could provide in the way of solution, that you began to see this leadership position emerging. Now, as we go forward, let's give a little bit of history of myself and that background. Again, I'm the editor and lead writer for the Procurement Insights blog. Procurement Insights launched in May 2007. Since then, I've written, of course, many articles, 3,000 articles and papers. I think that number is even much larger now, as well as written a number of books, 5 books on everything from, again, technology to public sector policy to emerging business trends, and, of course, the impact that social media has had, not only in general on the business world, but also in particular in procurement and purchasing itself. Now, of course, I'm a speaker, and I have a radio show that was launched in March 2009 called the PI Window on the World, and that's aired almost 900 episodes. And in that space, in that realm, I was able to talk to a lot of the business leaders, the thought leaders over this past decade to get an insight as to where the industry is going and having a handle on what the future holds. And that's really the basis from which we'll be talking today, and the idea for the Uberization of the procure-to-pay process or procure-to-pay process concept came. Now, I want to remind everybody that after the webinar, there'll be a tweet chat, hashtag Uber P2P chat. So I'd encourage you to join us. It'll be about a 15 to 20 minute discussion on on Twitter. And I also found that these types of formats after a webinar are good because they give you a chance to ask more questions and give you a chance to engage with a broader, what I call the procurement posse. There's a group of us who are very, what you could call vocal and knowledgeable and engaging, and we want you into our group to be able to share some ideas and hear what other people and other experts and industry thought leaders have to say. And so you have a chance to join us on that basis. Now let's talk about today in particular and what we're going to focus on. And I want to stress this as well. This is going to be an interactive experience. So rather than have you, and although there will be a Q&A session at the end of this, rather than have you sit on your hands and hold your questions, you're going to find there's a couple of things happening here. Number one, there will be polls at the beginning of each section that we'll ask you, but it's also an opportunity. We want to encourage you to post questions via the chat, and I'll be monitoring the chat room so that I want you to be able to interact with me on a real-time basis. So this is very much going to be you and I working together and communicating together in a partnership. Now, today's agenda, how Uber's $3.5 billion lesson in how the world should work instead of optimizing for how the world does work. We're going to look into how it applies to the procure-to-pay world. Now, I have to tell you that in terms of the procure-to-pay world and in terms of Uberization, it's become a standard. And some of the questions that we'll look at in terms of this is Uber, or is what it's done, is it an innovative, can you call it a disruptive innovator or an innovation? Or is it a disruptive improver? And I'll get into that a little bit more, but we'll cover that area as we talk about the procure-to-pay world. On the other side, when we go to the next point, a technical standpoint or technological standpoint, what are the links between the procure-to-pay platform and Uber? Are there lines of comparison that we can draw from this? And then the third area, of course, is how does procurement effectively leverage a Uberized procure-to-pay platform? And this is going to be an important section because one of the things is having the capability and the technological capability to efficiently operate a procure-to-pay platform and drive the results or the expected outcomes. The opportunity to do that is not the same as actually capitalizing on that. And we're going to talk about a gap or some of the obstacles that are presented from being able to fully utilize P2P in the same way that Uber has revolutionized travel and delivery. So again, I would encourage you very much, if you have any questions at any time, to post them into the chat room. Now let's talk about the Uberization lesson. What specifically can we learn? Well, let's start with the first poll, and is Uber a disruptive innovator? Now, the poll will be coming up momentarily, and you can take about a minute to respond. But is Uber a disruptive innovator? Yes, no, or what is a disruptive innovator? And that may be a question you may want to ask in the chat room. You know, when you think about disruptive innovation or being a disruptive innovator, what does that mean? So as you can see, it's here. We got a time limit of about 18 seconds, so please put in your answer or response. I think I should cue the Jeopardy music at this point. All right. So 75% say yes, and 25% say, what is a disruptive innovator? Well, you know, it's kind of interesting in there is that if you look at them as being a disruptive innovator, you may be very much surprised by the answer. They're not. They're really not a disruptive innovator. Now, let's draw a comparison in terms of this and why. Cloud computing or mobile internet service like the smartphone industry, which solved a problem we didn't know we had. Unlike them, Uber and similar to Amazon did not father a new product or service that had not previously existed. Now think about that for just a second, because if you look at it and you say, wait a second, isn't that innovation in itself? Well, in reality, the fact remains is that the internet service and the smartphone industry, you know, we become a mobile world. Prior to that, there was no mobility in terms of real mobility, in terms of our ability to communicate beyond the phone call. In other words, when we were working in the industry and looking at being able to unchain ourselves from our desk and be able to communicate in real time, the smartphones, the evolution of the smartphone, the internet, the capability that gave to us, that created a whole new market, a whole new industry. Uber, they really create a whole new industry, you know, and that's the whole key. When you look at disruptive innovators, you talk about the fact that they've created alternative products and services to what was available. In essence, they created a new market. Example I give is smartphones. Well, the latter found innovative ways to extend capabilities within an existing market, a better use of the smartphone. So Uber didn't invent the smartphone. They didn't invent the technology that enables them to be able to provide their service. They didn't create a new market, but what they did is created a better way to use the existing technology. Now, let me expand on this a little bit further, and please again feel free to offer your thoughts. Amazon, and let's deal there. They're a retailer that allowed resellers around the world. What they did is they brought them all together and they enabled resellers or retailers rather to reach a larger pool. But they didn't. They leverage innovative technology. They didn't invent that technology. They didn't invent the internet. They created platforms to leverage that capability, but they were not the ones who had created the basis or the foundation for that breakthrough. Now, Uber does the same thing by manipulating connections in the marketplace through the use of existing technology. So really the use of smartphones and mobile devices. Now there's a reason I'm talking about this in terms of disruptive innovator versus disruptive improver. Because in many ways, and I'll go to the next slide, in many ways, when we're talking about Uberizing Procure-to-pay, we're not talking about creating a new technology. The technology already exists. But we're talking about creating better ways to leverage existing technology. Think about that for a moment. Better ways to leverage existing technology. How can you do that? And that's what we're talking about in terms of Uberizing Procure-to-pay. Now, there's going to be a chart that's going to come up in a few slides, and I'm going to show you the bell curve of adoption and where the technological capability of Procure-to-pay is and where the adoption is in terms of users taking full advantage of that. Because we're not looking at having to reinvent the industry or do Procure-to-pay better with technology. What we're focusing on, and that's a key part of the Uberization example and the parallel here, is what we're focusing on is better utilization or improving our utilization of the existing technology as it stands today. I just want you to think of that for a moment. The technology, and remember when I did the opening commentary, introduction to Zycus, I talked about the fact is that here they are, they're a recognized leader in 2013, 2015, 2017. But in reality, I started uncovering years before that. Their technology has matured and evolved and certainly added more features and functions and capabilities. But in reality, they're the same solid foundation of technological capability that they were 10 years ago that they are today. They've made advancements. They've made improvements. But the reality is that technological capabilities always existed. It has been our ability to utilize that technology, our ability or willingness to go beyond the familiar and comfort that we had, let's say, to a certain degree with the ERP world, to recognize that these innovative procure-to-pay solutions are really not a bolt-on addition to an existing ERP, but are actually the driving force behind driving a higher level of efficiency and output through the procure-to-pay world. So that's really where I'm talking about. And when I go back to that original poll question, are they a disruptive innovator? Not technically speaking, because again, procure-to-pay, Uber, is not a disruptive innovator because they really leveraged existing technology to do things better. And that's what we're talking about today in terms of procure-to-pay. And that's the question that we want you to ask yourself when you look at procure-to-pay, when you look at what you're using or contemplating using. What are the obstacles preventing you from being able to fully utilize procure-to-pay solutions? And that's the Uberization parallel. Now, how is procure-to-pay the same as Uber? Well, we've got another poll here. Number 2, which area of the procure-to-pay process best aligns with the Uber model? Think about this for a moment. Buyer interface, supplier engagement, risk management, or payment process. Take a few seconds to answer that. I'll be interested to see what you have to say. And there we go. All right, so let's see the response. Should be coming up just shortly. 50% say buyer interface, 50% say supplier interface, risk management and payment process. And again, that's an interesting thing that you point out in terms of that. So we got 50 for buyer interface, 50 for supplier engagement. So let's look at this. Well, let's talk about this to begin with. P2P technology must preserve the genius of people and free them focus on where their abilities can be best utilized. Now think about that. In terms of P2P, what is the whole idea of that? What does it do in terms of your utilization of that platform? How does it free you? You know, let's look at the Uber comparison. You're now able to hail a cab automatically. You have more drivers available. You have more capability to get from point A to point B, sometimes cheaper, sometimes more expensive, depending upon where you're utilizing the service, and that's an important thing to note. But the reality is at the end of the day, what Uber provides and what P2P has to provide is it gives people the freedom to focus on other areas of which they're most efficient at. In other words, strategic thinking, process design, and management by exception. And when I talk about that, and you're looking in the context of buyer interface, you know, what's interesting is that if you look at the buyer PCE equation, and I call it that, price, convenience, and overall customer experience, one thing is that what we do at home and how we buy at home, and this is really tied into Amazon, has created a level of expectation that it raises the question, well, if we can procure goods and services so easily at home through an Amazon-type platform, why can't we do that at work? You know, if you think back to the technology, and some of you who've been in the procurement world for a long time will know, is that the process of automation, the process of leveraging technology wasn't as convenient as it was as if you just went on and ordered a book through Amazon or purchased something on eBay. The fact remains is that when you look at what Uber's done in terms of making price, convenience, and overall customer experience fast and stronger and easier for people to use. That's why they've grown that so dramatically and have become such an influential force in the industry. You have to look at the P2P equation in the same light. We've now turned the procurement process into a convenience. We've now turned it into the ability to reach more suppliers in a shorter period of time, to get the best price, to get the best experience and the best result. So the buyer interface on that particular part, the influence it has, I think, is very, very important. Now, going to driving supplier business. Now, let's look at Amazon and suppliers in the P2P world. They want convenient access to more potential buyers and a chance to win more business. There's a better engagement. Onboarding is much easier with the P2P solutions than they were through the old ERP platforms or the traditional applications. Now, it's interesting, and I want to clarify this, and what I said at the very beginning is back Zycus has been around for a long time. They're not new technologies. They're a stable, strong company that has a solid foundation, as many of the other players in the P2P space have. The reality is it's only within the last few years that there's been this realization or awakening to what the capability of P2P is, beyond, again, the traditional confines of the ERP world or how we viewed the use of technology in the past to expedite the buying process. Now, the Uber connection, well, that fits around the driver's lives. In other words, the drivers have the convenience to be able to, when they're going to drive, which opportunities they're going to be respond to. So, again, the procure-to-pay process from the buyer interface standpoint and from the supplier engagement standpoint, those are key areas that have helped to elevate the profession, elevate the engagement between buyer and seller, to create greater opportunities for savings, to create greater opportunities for efficiencies in terms of time savings. And, of course, going back to what I originally mentioned previously, is the ability to free us up to focus on areas where our attention is best served, strategic thinking, again, managing exceptions and all of those things. So certainly, and this aligns with the survey, certainly the buyer interface and the supplier engagement are indeed key elements. But I want to touch on the two of which there was no response: risk management and the payment process, because it reflects to us the limited scope of how we view P2P capability. I mean, and this is why this is an interesting question. Every time I ask this, it's funny. There's very few people actually point to risk management and payment process when they think of P2P and comparing it to the innovative capabilities of Uber. If you look at and I call this risky business, if you look at it, having fast and easy access to critical data points to be able to significantly minimize risks of engagement by, of course, increasing the ability to engage more suppliers with verified suppliers, especially as we go to a global platform, supply chain. It's now a reality through different third-party solutions that can work in conjunction with the P2P world. One such solution is global risk management solutions. There are the beauty of the technology, and this is the thing I want to sort of digress a little bit on. The beauty of the technology, and I've been in the high-tech world since the early 80s. The beauty of the technology of P2P technology today is that it provides a modularity of bringing together the best of breed solutions to focus on key areas to collect or create a collective or a whole solution. And so the filtering process of engagement and being able to manage risk effectively, and that risk includes supplier management and bringing on suppliers and the stability of your supply chain, that's a key element of that. You see, because with the P2P world, if you were only limited to the suppliers you knew or with whom you were familiar, ultimately you run into a potential risk. I'm reminded of a major retailer in the U.S. who had gone through a vendor compression strategy, reduced the number of suppliers with whom they dealt, and they felt they were driving savings by fewer transactions and greater volumes. In reality, 3 years after they made that decision, an assessment was made into the marketplace, and this is a retail chain, a large retail chain, and they discovered that they were paying 22-23% above the going market rate. What happened is when they had compressed or lessened the number of suppliers with whom they had dealt, what ultimately happened is that they lost what you know as the reference point to where the market was really heading and what they were purchasing. Now, they were dealing with largely indirect MRO material, but the key here is that what happens is that compressing your supply base is not a route to greater savings. In fact, it's a route to increased cost, and it happens almost imperceptibly, but it happens over time. When you're able to engage a broader supply base, which is what P2P technology does, you create a better environment to drive greater opportunities from the buying standpoint to be able to have your cost aligned with what's going on in the marketplace on a real-time basis. And you're also opening up the opportunity for more suppliers with whom you may not have done business. So when we talk about this, you look at that and say, yes, but is there an increased risk associated with broader engagement? And P2P technology platforms address this in much the same way Uber has. Now, there has been criticisms about Uber. Organizations said, well, it's unsafe. How can we trust drivers? How can we do all of these things? Now, in the earlier days, yes, there was an element of risk, but over time, I'll refer to what Uber is doing now, they require all prospective drivers to submit a motor vehicle and criminal background check. They run background checks that date back 7 years, and multi-state criminal database search when you talk about in the U.S., and you can, reference point is Investopedia in here. The key here is that by expanding out the capability for people to engage and connect, a larger number of people connecting with a broader range of drivers, what it does is it creates the opportunity to greater convenience. It can drive costs lower. But the fact remains is that when you think of P2P, it's elements of being able to come together and create access, a risk-free access to a larger pool of suppliers, a larger pool of potential suppliers, is an opportunity that you have to be able to capitalize on. And I think that's very, very important. And that's one of those areas, and I'm going to be showing the graph pretty soon in terms of the gap between what is being utilized and the technological capabilities of what you could utilize. But relative to the risk, this is a key element. When you look at quick pay capability, payment process, found it very, very, very interesting that, how does this work? And I'll delve into this momentarily in the next section. But with P2P systems, an invoice comes in and is automatically validated against internal rules and external data sources, and then reconciled and approved for payment. The technological capability is there. Now, is it being capitalized? I don't think it is, not to the full extent. Now, the Uber is convenient because it's easy to use and pay with your credit card. You can split fares with other passengers, but think about all the capabilities that Uber has brought in terms of their innovative improvements to faring passengers around or delivery service capabilities. All of these things are key. So when I see and go back to our original poll results, buyer interface and supplier engagement, with P2P to Uberize the P2P process, to take full advantage of the technological capabilities that exist, you have to be able to extend beyond buyer interface and supplier engagement and see the potential from the standpoint of risk management and payment process. Now, here's that graph I talked about. And you're probably all familiar with this. I mean, it's a very similar graph to what was in Malcolm Gladwell's tipping point and a bell curve of innovation and adopters. And one of the things I want to point out in terms of my research on this is that the blue is the P2P tech capability. The red is where we are now, and that is indicative of where the obstacles to adoption are. Why are people, first question is, are people utilizing P2P technology to their full capability or to its full capability? Are they gaining the conveniences and the advantages of P2P technology? And as it stands right now, I would say that we're really lagging behind. P2P technology is at its zenith. It's at its delta in terms of what it can do in terms of being a disruptive improver. But the capabilities and the obstacles are what's holding back the full adoption and utilization. And I want to, in this next section, examine what those potential obstacles are. In other words, let's talk about harnessing the Uber procure-to-pay potential. Now, with this next poll, I want to ask this question. Which area below presents the greatest obstacle to Uberize procure-to-pay? Is it buyer interface? Is it supplier engagement? Is it risk management, payment process, or other? Now, take a few seconds to look at this because, again, as we go through this, and I just want to recap this, when you look at organizations, when you look at the P2P process and run it parallel to what Uber is doing, the capabilities are there. They've built this capabilities based upon not so much an innovation of the technology, the innovation is taking place, but based upon the full utilization of that existing technology. And when you look at the areas that we talked about just in the previous section, what we're saying to ourselves is, okay, buyer interface and supplier onboarding, these are all things that we believe is where the greatest parallels of the Uberization have taken place, will take place. But in the other areas, it's just not happening. Now, I find it interesting here is that 50% say risk management is the greatest obstacle. Supplier engagement is 25%, and payment process is 25%. Now, you know what? It's encouraging to see that it falls within that particular area. Well, let's do this. I want to open up the chat room to people, and I'd certainly be interested in hearing what you had to say in terms of why you chose those examples. As I go along and talk, tell me, pose a question. Why do you believe that, for example, risk management is the greatest obstacle to Uberize procure-to-pay? I'm going to share with you as I'm talking what I view and what I've found as being one of the greatest challenges. My choice would be payment process. According to the Institute of Financial Operations, and this is referencing a Gartner study, day sales outstanding, or DSO, are at record levels, averaging 42 days in the U.S. Now, I think the numbers have even increased more substantially since that point in time. And the reason being is why is this so important? Why is supplier payment so important? Well, what's the cause of it? Well, to start, 63% of all past due payments, which take about 2 to 3 times longer to pay than clean invoices, are found to be defective invoices that originate with the supplier. In other words, they don't align or match. That was the finding in terms of that particular study. However, it's an interesting thing is that with this particular obstacle, and I just want to go back here to this previous slide, if I could. If you look at the problems with suppliers in terms of the ability to have and what they call defective invoices that don't reconcile, I think that's that's a problem that can be addressed and solved with P2P technology as it stands today. And that's a key point, better engagement, better reconciliation. But here's an interesting point. But despite the link between keeping suppliers happy and the ability for buyers to offer the best products at affordable prices, there's a lack of motivation on the part of buyers to pay suppliers faster. In other words, addressing that problem, which can be done through P2P, does not necessarily address the problem of slow payment. And this study came from May 2014, an annual automotive OMA supplier relations study. And they talked about the link between supplier happiness and engagement with the big four and the ability to offer the best products at affordable prices. And the study found that those organizations who had suppliers and good, solid relationships with their suppliers were the ones who were able to deliver the best products. Now, the key is, of course, keeping a supplier happy is paying them on a timely basis. However, The payment process, in the end, the procure-to-pay solutions cannot overcome the lack of the will to streamline the payment process in a way that will deliver the value. You have to look at it and say, okay, is the technological P2P capability there to streamline it? Is the capability there in terms of not only onboarding suppliers, but processing invoices and creating a process that eliminates those defective invoices? Yes, the technological capability is there. It's not a limitation associated with P2P. The limitation comes in the desire or the will to do that. Now, one of the things we talk about, and you know what, let me just see, because I did have another slide in there that is not in there now. Give me just a minute and I'll pull up the information, because I thought this was an important point to make, is that if you look at the link between the two, one of the biggest concerns that people have relative to this is, or the questions they have is, why is it that buying organizations are unwilling to pay suppliers faster? That's the real question. If you realize that you can have a happy supplier and a good supplier relationships, and it can lead to an improvement in the quality of output and the product that you can deliver, or services that you can deliver to your end customer, and keeping the supplier happy, paying them on a timely basis is key. Why doesn't that happen so frequently? Why is that a major problem? And that continues to be an obstacle to adoption. And going back to the slide I had with the bell curve, the technological capability of P2P is there, but the ability to do the adoption or utilization of that is lagging behind. There is that gap. So realistically speaking, from my standpoint, is that, and this goes back to what I had stressed previously, in the end, the capability exists within Procure-to-pay beyond buyer efficiency or convenience and supplier engagement or onboarding. It extends to these other areas of risk management. It extends to other areas, including expediting the payment process. And that's the key thing that we want to look at in terms of Uberizing Procure-to-pay. We have greater capability, I guess to sum it up, we have a greater capability to leverage P2P technology far more than we're doing today. And looking in these areas that we haven't traditionally looked at and considering the capabilities from that standpoint is what will allow us to have not only P2P technology, but ultimately P2P technology to allow procurement to have the impact and the strategic force it can be for a particular organization. So that's really what it comes down to when I talk about Uberizing and the parallel. So let me ask you, do you have any questions or comments that you'd like to share in terms of what you heard? Do you agree? Do you disagree with what I've said? And that's fine. I'm not looking for consensus. Just to throw out ideas and share them with you, and based on my experience, this is how I've seen P2P evolve over the last decade. What questions might you have? And let me just see if there is one that has come up and been submitted. Hang on one second. Okay. Okay, here's an interesting point. Somebody had asked on slide 17, you made reference to the gap between technological capability and user adoption. What were the main obstacles that caused user adoption to lag behind technological capability? All right, well, you know, it's an interesting question there. Like, what is the cause of that lag? I certainly put that on the graph saying, here it is. Here's the graph showing that P2P technology is at point A, and we're lagging behind on that. Well, one of the questions, or my response in terms of that, is that, you know, historically, innovative technologies like P2P were capable of delivering almost immediate value for a significantly lower cost than what was achievable with traditional e-procurement applications. I'm talking about within the ERP framework. And they were dismissed or ignored. Again, they were referred to ultimately as being bolt-on solutions. Now, the primary reason for this is that having to explain that why these platforms were a problem is people have made such great investment in the ERP technology, millions and millions of dollars and times and cycles and resources to implement that. They weren't producing the result. The vast majority of ERP initiatives failed and failed miserably, costing organizations a great deal of money. And I can point to many, many examples. So here you have an investment that isn't paying off, that's in the amounts of millions of dollars. And on the other side of the coin, you have this new emerging P2P technology that can be implemented within a fraction of the time, or a fraction of the cost. How do you stand before your board and say, you know what, we have the capability to make an improvement in procurement, even though we've already made the investment in this area? How do you stand before a board and say, say, wait a second, we can do this, but it's cheaper and faster to be able to do that. And that was an obstacle for many, many years. And finally, as the old saying goes, the emperor has no clothes, as the saying goes. What's happened is there's been a general acknowledgement and a realization is that the ERP platforms of the past, and Gartner called it the post-ERP era, is the realization is that while ERPs are good for the back end financial elements or aspects of an operation or an organization, one of the things that they discovered is that its functionality, or finally admitted, is that the functionality that's needed on the front end was not best suited to that, and that's where the P2P technology came in, and that's one of the reasons why, for example, that there has been a recognition. I'll go back to the original slide at the very beginning with Zyka as a leader in 2013, 2015, 2017, is with that a willingness to admit that the previous way of doing it wasn't working, and that there was a better way of doing it, a better way, and that's the Uberization effect to which I'm talking about. Better way of doing it has opened the doors to more people stepping forward. However, that hasn't happened on a large scale basis. There's still some lag behind, and that's the gap in which to be able to use it and meet with it. And going back to any type of innovative improver, and not innovator but improver, there's always a reluctance to be able to embrace new technology. There's always fears of potential risk and other elements that could become problematic. So, in that regard, the user capability and adoption, a lot of it came down to the fact is acknowledging what was being done before, despite the heavy investment of money and time, wasn't working, and the ability to embrace what could work and how it could work better. Now, let's see if there's any other questions coming in. I have another one. When you talk about narrowing that gap, and still on the subject of the chart, why do I say the gap should narrow instead of will narrow? When I talked about that importance between the red line of user adoption and P2P technological capability, it should narrow because, ultimately, there's factors within this industry that are going to slow that. The industry giants, for example, aren't going to go silently into the night. There's the realization that organic development, I'm talking about the core players, and we can talk about what IBM has done with an Taurus and other organizations making acquisitions, is that the established giants will look to either create service provider relationships or acquire them outright. Now, some of the things that's very interesting is with the former, establishing these relationships with the up-and-coming service providers are very important. It's bilateral advantage to both organizations to come together, especially given that the larger players in the industry do not have and I'll call it the organic ability to develop these solutions. However, there's an inherent amount of reluctance by some of the larger players to enter into those kinds of arrangements because it's the case of the tail wagging the proverbial dog. In other words, we've always seen the ERP and the ERP providers as being the heavyweights, and they are, but the technology that can drive the greatest innovation and improvements in procurement aren't naturally resident with those heavyweights. And as a result, you have to either reach out and form the relationships, or conversely, and this is where some will go in, and that's why we're going to see an increasing number of acquisitions on the horizon. We're going to see organizations saying, rather than partnering, I'd rather acquire and in some cases assimilate. Now, the only problem with that is that in the past, historically, looking at organizations like Oracle when they acquired J.D. Edwards or when they acquired PeopleSoft, is that what they did is they acquired the technology, but they didn't acquire the culture. They didn't acquire the whole thing that made those organizations so unique. And in adopting an acquire and assimilation strategy, the fear is that a lot of that innovation, a lot of that entrepreneurial thinking that made the companies great to begin with will be lost. And so when you look at this, and that's why I say it should narrow, but will it narrow? I don't know in what time frame, but the next 12, 18, and 24 months are going to be very, very interesting because the market is going to shift, and it's either going to be through strategic partnerships or it's going to be an acquire and assimilation process. And I think we have to watch that because that will affect adoption. And just to add on the latter or back end of that, when you look at assimilation, again, I think that is a route that's going to happen. I just don't think it's the best route to go. So that's my thoughts relative to that. Now, I've got another question that has come up. And again, if you have more, please, you can share them either directly in the chat, or you can, join us for the tweet chat afterwards. In one of the last slides, let me see this, you indicate that one of the obstacles to Uberizing P2P is an unwillingness on the part of buyers to streamline the payment process, specifically paying suppliers faster. And I think I touched on this a little bit. Why do you believe there's a reluctance to pay suppliers faster? And that's a good question. And there's been many reasons given as to why buyers are slow to come around to the concept of paying suppliers faster, including some have offered the excuse that it's a competitive disadvantage. Other studies, though, generally speaking, and such as the one I reference on the slide, indicate that those organizations that have the best relationship with suppliers offer superior products at a competitive price. And I want you to think about that for a moment, because this could be a point of contention for some of you, saying, well, wait, if we have great relationship with our suppliers, there's a logic that you're going to be able to deliver a superior product, better service. You may or may not agree with that, and that's an interesting point. Putting that as a poll question. Do you believe, for example, that good supplier relationships ultimately result in your ability to better provide service and products to your end customers? But the reality is that the studies, the one that I cited in the automotive industry, found that indeed the fact remains is that being able to have that good relationship, which includes paying suppliers earlier, more efficiently, eliminating some of the issues with regard to the faulty invoicing or invoices that don't align with what you have on your records, and thus they get sort of jammed up in the queue. The reality is the technological capability of P2P is there to address that first part. But the willingness to do it, that's going to be the key. And, I think you have to drill down and look at the numbers and look at your organization. The automotive study was one example. There are many other examples that says, look, if we are able to create liquidity in our supply base, especially as we strive to engage small, medium enterprises, that ability will come back to us in other benefits. You have to delve into that, and I would encourage you to do that. But basically speaking, and I'll go on this basic premise, is that in terms of payment and early payment capability, the excuses that are given to retain capital and the impact it has on bottom lines, I think that there's a certain degree of merit in that. However, I think it's gone too far over to the right and swung over on one side at the expense of, again, supplier relationships. And, that's really the key, is what you're doing in terms of your payment strategy or your payment process. Is that having a negative impact on your supply base and your supplier relations? And if it is, what's the cost of that? And so all I'm offering here is to say you have to look at the whole picture in that rather than one side or the other. Look at the complete window in terms of that information. Now I have one more question. I think we're running out of time. I have one more question that came by. When you say that buyer-supplier relationships, I just talked about this, are moving towards a more collaborative, transparent framework. What do you mean, and how does P2P play a role in this? Okay, let's look at this in terms of a collaborative framework. And this extends beyond the technology, and that's a key point, even beyond P2P capability. I'm going to cite the I-35 Bridge project in Minnesota to illustrate my point of how greater collaboration, and this does have a direct impact on faster payment, shared risk, and all of those elements. Many of you may or may not remember when the bridge collapsed in Minnesota. It was a very tragic event. And so what ultimately happened is they had to rebuild that bridge, but they had the added pressure, of course, of doing it quickly because they needed to restore a major artery into the center. But they also wanted to do so quickly, build it quickly, to pay tribute to those who lost their lives or were affected by this. And so they took an architectural approach that was completely new and innovative, with which everyone was unfamiliar. And so what the state of Minnesota did is they said, look, we're going to literally move away from our traditional approach to procurement and this kind of contracting, and we're going to work on a transparent and open basis with our supply partners. And what they ultimately did is it was an open book policy. There was true communication and true collaboration. Long and the short of it is that the bridge, which again was an architectural triumph because they had never used that particular approach to constructing a bridge, was built on time and on budget. In fact, I think it was even a little bit below budget. Now, let me compare this, because this is an important thing, because this goes to the spirit that extends beyond the technology of supplier-buyer relationships. The very next project they had to build a bridge, which wasn't under the same crisis scenario, the very next project, they reverted back to their way of doing business. Well, the bridge was 2 to 3 years overdue and way over budget. So tying that back in terms of moving towards open and more transparent relationships, and tying back into the procure-to-pay and the faster pay process and minimizing risk process, is that it is not a technological problem. That capability to engage and have open transparency is not limited by technology. P2P technology is capable of delivering so much more. It's the will to be able to do that. And examples like the I-35 bridge demonstrate how we have to collectively and collaboratively work together to bridge that gap. And it goes back to that first question, or the second question of narrowing the gap between the obstacles and where user adoption is today and P2P technological capability is truly right at this particular point in time. And narrowing that gap means that we'll have to step out from the technology and view key areas of how we do business in the procurement world and beliefs that we've held for so long. We have to step back and say, okay, wait a second, we've got to change the way we do this. We have to be able to take a new approach and see it in a new light. And then and only will that gap narrow, and only then will we be able to utilize P2P technology and fully Uberize it? So those are some very good questions, and I thank you for that. Again, I want to remind everybody at this point in time, and I'm going to turn it back to the main Zyka's office to take control or presenter control as I sign off. I want to remind everybody that the Uber P2P chat, use hashtag Uber P2P chat. We'll be going to that immediately following this particular session, and I'd encourage you to join us and ask questions or track comments at that particular time. I do believe that this session is going to be recorded and made available in terms of on demand, which is always good. You can listen to it again. And despite the technical hiccups at the beginning, I'm glad we're able to be able to share our time today. So without further delay, and there's my contact information if you need to reach me. Without further delay, I'll turn it back to Zykas.